we've now got one card visible on the screen, so we still have to show those other two cards. So in this video, we're going to take a look at a couple of different diagrams to explain how we might show those other two cards in a Angular style fashion. Okay, so a couple diagrams. So in this first diagram right here, I want to explain some very simplistic way and not a very good Angular approach that we might just try to show those other two cards. So a very simplistic way would be to open up our app component HTML file. Inside there, we could take all the HTML that we just wrote for the tree card and then duplicate it twice down. And then in each of those duplicated segments of HTML, we could start to change some of the text and make sure that one reflects some properties of, say, the mountains card, and the other is for biking. So in other words, duplicate HTML and just change some stuff inside there. This is really not a very good approach because we're talking about taking some HTML structure and just willy-nilly duplicating it throughout our application. What would happen if we decided to add in more cards? Well, if we decided to add in more cards, we would just be duplicating more HTML. If we then decided to change the structure of our card, like change the HTML, we would have to go back to each and every one of these snippets and change each one by hand. Definitely not very good. So rather than duplicating all that HTML, we're going to create something called a component to make this little bit of HTML that we're trying to create more reusable in nature. So the thing I want you to take away here is that anytime that we are duplicating HTML, it is frequently a sign that we might want to try to create a component. There are other ways in Angular to reduce HTML duplication, but definitely thinking about creating a component is a good place to get started. Now, we've kind of been having the term component float around quite a bit in this course so far. So in this video, I want to really explain to you what a component is. So we're going to go over a couple notes here. I know there's a lot of text here on the screen. We're going to go through this rather quickly because we're going to see attributes of each of these different notes very quickly inside this application that we're working on. Okay, couple notes. So first off, all Angular applications that we create are going to be assembled out of different components that we make. In other words, the vast majority of your time working on an Angular application is going to be spent creating different components and then assembling them together to actually make a usable application. Each component that you and I create is going to be designed to implement or show one single thing, or really a widget, to the user on the screen. So let me show you an example right away. So here on the left-hand side, we have what looks like a little drop-down kind of button. We might create a component to encapsulate all the behavior of this little widget right here. We might also create a component to, say, show a series of navigation tabs to a user. We might also create more complex components, like maybe something called a repository component that shows details about some Git repository or something like that to the user as well. So in general, we try to create components to show single widgets to a user. We try to make these components as reusable as possible, and then to build an actual Angular application, we're going to spend all of our time taking these components and assembling them together in some fashion. Okay, next note. So whenever we create a component, it's going to wrap up all the HTML and all the code, all the CSS required to make that one little widget work correctly. So very soon, you and I are going to, as you'd probably guess, create a new component meant to display an individual card to the user. When we create that component, we're going to write out all the CSS, all the HTML, all the code required to make this thing work correctly inside of the relevant component files. Next up, a component can be reused multiple times in the same application. So in general, you and I try to make components that are as reusable as possible. And then we try to configure those components to work in slightly different ways. So for example, for our application, we're going to create one reusable component called a card component. That's going to really just represent all this stuff right here. We're then going to reuse that component 3 times. One to show the tree stuff, one for mountain, and one for biking. The one component that gets reused. Next up, components can be nested or shown inside of each other. So let's go back to that example that we looked at just over here with these 3 different components. Let's imagine that we took these 3 different components and we wanted to form an actual application out of them. Maybe something that looks like this right here. So on the left-hand side, maybe we'd have the tabs for navigation, and then this repositories thing, and then for some reason, a drop-down button on the top right-hand side. To build something like this, we would take these 3 different components, we would create one copy of each of them, and then to show them to the user on the screen, we would nest all of them in something called the app component. And so we would end up with a structure that looks like this right here. This is what we call a component hierarchy diagram. So this means that at the very top, we have an app component that is responsible for showing our entire application to the user. And then inside that component, we have nested 3 others. We have nested the dropdown, tabs, and repository. And nesting these different components together is what gets them visible on the screen. Now the app component right here at the very top, as you might guess, is actually that app stuff that we've been working on inside of our projects so far. So this app thing, well, I know the name really implies it, the app thing is a component in itself. So we've already been working with a component quite a bit. As we start to add in other components to our application, we are going to nest them inside of this app component that we already have to get our new components visible on the screen. Okay, just 1 or 2 more notes here. So next up, like we just said, every app has a component called app component, and it's always going to be the most parent component. In other words, that thing gets shown by default inside of our application. And then in order to show other content to the user, we're going to place other components inside of the app component. We're going to do that right away for this very first application, so you'll see a good example of this almost immediately. All right, and final note here, every component we create has its own component class, which we've already worked with quite a bit, its own component template, which we've worked with, its own component CSS file, and a spec file as well. We haven't really discussed testing or spec files at all. That's something that we definitely are going to get into quite a bit throughout this course. Okay, so that's it. Some high-level notes on components. So let's take a pause right here. When we come back to the next video, we're going to create our own very first component meant to represent these different cards that we are showing to the user and use it to show the tree on the screen. So let's take care of that in just a moment.